They had set no place for her at the betrothal feast, and Lynette Caro had made her peace with the corner by the sideboard before the soup was even cleared. So when the Duke of Rathmore rose from his own table, crossed the length of the hall in 11 long strides, and lifted her onto his knee before 400 witnesses, she understood, with the particular clarity of a woman watching her whole small life come undone, that supper, at least, was over. She would remember it longest, afterward, not for the scandal of it, but for the ordinary, unbearable fact that his coat still smelled of the stable, of cedar and horse and rain, as if a duke had no business smelling of anything so honest. Had she known what the lifting would cost them both, she would have let herself be let out through the scullery door all the same, and called it a mercy. But she did not know it yet, and so she sat where she was put, spine straight as a hymnal, and waited to see what the room would do with its shock. The room, for its part, did what rooms of that kind always did. It went silent the way a held breath goes silent, and then it began, very quietly, to talk. Gabriel Ashworth, 6th Duke of Rathmore, had not meant to make a spectacle of his own betrothal feast. He had meant, an hour before, to eat his soup, endure the toasts, and get through the evening without looking too often at the woman seated nowhere in particular near the door, the one his cousin Adelia had somehow forgotten to give a chair. He had noticed the forgetting. He noticed most things that Adelia arranged to look like accidents. Rathmore Hall was dressed that night for a wedding it had not yet earned. Banners of white and gold looped along the gallery, the long table set with the second-best china, because the best was, Adelia said, too fine to risk on so large a company. 200 candles burned in the sconces, and the heat of them pressed down on the hall like a hand held flat against the back of the neck, the particular airless heat of high summer that made silk cling and tempers shorten. Seraphina Vale sat at Gabrielle's right in blue satin, the color of a January sky, tapping her closed fan once, twice. Against her gloved palm, watching the room the way a merchant watches a scale. She was, by every account that mattered to the county, the correct choice. Her father's money would mend the roofs at Rathmore and settle the tenant debts Adelia swore had accumulated like snow against a door, and in 6 weeks, at Michaelmas, the mending would be made permanent in the parish church. Michaelmas was also, though few in that hall knew it, the day Marigold Ashworth turned 10 years old, the day her late father's will named for the trustees to open her accounts and confirm her guardian fit, and Adelia Vane had built her calendar without appearing to build anything at all, so that both dates fell together. Lynette did not think of any of that as she stood near the door with her hands folded. She thought only of Marigold, seated small and pale between 2 aunts who had no real use for her, turning her spoon in circles without eating. The child had taken her tonic before supper, the bitter almond-smelling draught Adelia measured out herself each evening now, since the household physician had gone to Bath for his health and not yet returned. Lynette had watched her drink it and thought, not for the first time, that the color it left in Marigold's cheeks was wrong, a flush that sat too high and too red, like rouge badly applied. She rolled a pinch of dried lavender between her finger and thumb, an old habit of her mother's she had never broken, and told herself it was nothing. It was not nothing. Halfway through the fish course, Marigold's spoon clattered against her plate, and she went, all at once, the gray-white color of tallow, and slid sideways off her chair before either aunt so much as turned her head. Lynette was there before the second aunt had finished gasping, on her knees on the good floor in her plain gray gown, 2 fingers at the child's throat, counting. "She is breathing," Lynette said to no one and everyone. "Someone open the terrace doors. She wants air, not an audience." It was Adelia who reached them next, moving through the parting guests with the unhurried grace of a woman who had never in her life needed to run for anything. And it was Adelia who looked down at Lynette kneeling over the child and said, in a voice pitched to carry the whole length of the hall, gentle as milk, "How very quick Miss Caro always is when Marigold takes ill." One might almost think she expected it. The words did their work exactly as they were built to. A ripple went through the guests, the particular ripple of people delighted to have been given something to whisper about. Someone near the punch bowl said the word tonic, and someone else said the word mother, and the two words together did more damage in 4 seconds than a shouted accusation could have done in an hour, because they did not need to be finished to be understood. Lynette felt the room turn against her the way a tide turns, without announcement, all at once, simply going the other way. Perhaps, Adelia went on, softer still, it would be kindest for everyone if Miss Caro removed herself from the child's care until the matter is looked into. Tonight, I think. There is no reason she cannot sleep in the village. It was not a question. It was arranged already in the shape of her voice, the way all of Adelia's cruelties were arranged, so smoothly that refusing them looked like bad manners. Lynette, still kneeling, still counting the small flutter of pulse under her fingers, felt the whole room waiting to see her stand and go. She had spent 2 years in this house learning exactly how much space a poor relation was permitted to take up, and she knew, with the flat certainty of long practice, that this was the moment to take up none at all. She began, quietly, to rise. She did not reach her feet. Gabriel's hand closed over her shoulder first, not to stop her, but to lift her, and before she had decided whether to be grateful or afraid, she found herself carried the length of the hall in his arms like something salvaged from a fire, Marigold's own small hand still caught in hers, and set down, not in a chair fetched hastily from the wall, but directly onto his knee, in his own great chair at the head of his own table, in front of his betrothed, his cousin, his tenants, and 400 witnesses who would talk of nothing else for a month. "There is no place set for her," Adelia said, and for the first time that evening her gentle voice had an edge in it, thin as a blade seen only when it turns. "Then I will make one," Gabriel said, and the hall went so still that the candles seemed to hold their breath along with everyone else, and Serafina Vale's fan stopped its tapping mid-stroke and did not move again for the rest of the night. Nobody in the hall spoke first, and it was left to the blackbird outside on the terrace wall, indifferent to dukes and scandal alike, to fill the silence with its ordinary evening song, 3 notes and a trill, over and over, while 400 people decided all at once what they had just seen. Lynette decided, in the same breath, what she would do about it, which was nothing, because Marigold's fingers were still locked around hers, and the child's breathing had not yet steadied, and there were things more urgent in the world than her own mortification. Gabriel did not look at the guests. He looked down at the child, then, briefly, unreadably, at Lynette, and said only, "Fetch Dr. Ames from the village," someone, now, in a voice that carried without rising, the voice of a man who had never once needed to shout to be obeyed. By the time Marigold's color had returned, and she had been carried up to bed with Lynette beside her, the feast had resumed its shape around the gap they left, guests murmuring behind fans and wine cups, already composing the story they would tell in London by autumn. Lynette did not hear most of it. She sat by Marigold's bed until well past midnight, the rosewood chest that had been her mother's open on her lap, running her thumb along its familiar seams the way she always did when she needed her hands to be busy and her mind to be quiet, and did not yet know that the small brass catch at its base, worn smooth by 40 years of use, concealed anything at all. By the second morning after the feast, the whole county had heard some version of the story, and no two versions agreed on anything except that the Duke of Rathmore had done something no duke ought to do, and enjoyed it. Gabriel summoned Lynette to the library before breakfast, which she understood, correctly, to be less an invitation than a reckoning. And she went in with her chin level and her hands folded, and the particular stillness she had trained into herself over 2 years of being a woman with no standing and no choice but to survive it gracefully. He was standing at the window when she entered, turning the mourning ring on his smallest finger, the one that had been his brother's, a habit she had noticed months ago and never once remarked on. "You are not in trouble," he said, without turning around, which she did not entirely believe. "I did not imagine I was," she said. "I imagined I was in something considerably worse than trouble. I imagined I was the subject of a haul's worth of correspondence, most of it unkind, all of it inaccurate." That surprised a short breath of a laugh out of him, gone almost before it arrived, and he turned to face her at last. "You are remarkably composed for a woman half the county is presently calling my mistress. I have had 2 days to grow composed. You have had 2 days to grow used to being interesting. I imagine you are managing it rather worse than I am. I manage it by not reading the letters, a luxury," she said, "not afforded to companions who must carry the post tray." He almost smiled again and stopped himself, and she watched him stop himself, which told her more than the smile would have. "I did not lift you onto my knee, Miss Caro, to make a scandal of you." "No," she agreed. "You did it because it was faster than arguing with your cousin in front of 400 people. And because Marigold was frightened, and because you are, under the very correct exterior, a man who acts before he calculates the cost of acting. I am not offended. I am merely aware that I will be paying a cost you did not calculate either." He was quiet a moment, weighing that, turning the ring again. "What would you have me do?" "Announce to the hall that it meant nothing. It would be a kindness to your betrothed, at least. It would be a lie," he said, "and Seraphina is cleverer than most of the county. She will not thank me for insulting her with one." Lynette let that sit, because there was nothing in it she could safely answer, and because the door at that moment opened without a knock, admitting Hobbs with the breakfast tray held at the particular angle that meant he had been listening in the corridor and had timed his entrance to interrupt something. "Begging pardon, Your Grace. Miss Marigold is asking for her lesson book, and for Miss Caro. In that order, which I thought Your Grace would want to know, seeing as it settles the question of who this house belongs to rather better than any of last night's talk." "Thank you, Hobbs," Gabriel said. "Dry. That will be all. It will be, Your Grace, when I've said my piece, which is that a place is not given in a house like this one. It is kept. Miss Caro has kept hers 2 years running, tending a child nobody else troubled to tend properly, and if half the county wishes to make a scandal of a chair, I'd say the scandal reflects rather better on the chair than on the county." He set the tray down with the finality of a man who had been in service 40 years and had long since stopped fearing dismissal, and left before either of them could answer him. Lynette found, to her own mild astonishment, that her eyes had gone unexpectedly warm, and she blinked it away before Gabriel could see it and make something of it. "My mother used to say the same thing," she said. "Nearly the same words. A place is not given. It is kept." "Your mother," Gabriel said, careful now, watching her the way he watched a horse he did not yet trust to stand still. "She was the apothecary here, before my time. I have heard the name Caro spoken in this house before, in tones I did not care for." "Then you have heard more than I have," Lynette said, and something in her voice closed like a door, gently but entirely. "She died when I was 18, and what happened to her good name died rather earlier than that. I would rather not discuss it over breakfast. He did not press her, which she noted, and filed away, along with the rest of the small evidence she had been quietly gathering for 2 years regarding the true shape of the man underneath the title. "Very well," he said. "Then we will discuss terms instead. You will remain at Rathmore as Marigold's governess and companion, as you have been. The wedding proceeds at Michaelmas as planned. Whatever the county chooses to believe about last Thursday, it will believe rather less of it once it sees nothing further to feed on." "A sound plan," Lynette said, "assuming nothing further happens." She did not know, saying it, how nearly she had named the entire remainder of the story in a single sentence. The soft threat came 3 days later, delivered so gently that Lynette did not recognize it as a threat until she had already carried it up 2 flights of stairs and turned it over twice in the privacy of her own room. Adelia Vane found her in the still room, where Lynette kept her mother's chest and mixed the plain, harmless waters, the lavender and rose and chamomile, that were the only medicines she had ever been permitted to touch in that house, and stood in the doorway a long moment before speaking, smoothing the seam of one glove with the pad of her thumb, over and over, a small private habit Lynette had noticed before without understanding it. "You have a gift for making yourself indispensable to people who cannot afford you," Adelia said. "It is, I confess, a talent I admire, in the abstract. In the particular, it worries me. I am a governess, Mrs. Vane. Indispensability is rather the job. It is when it stays within its bounds." Adelia crossed to the window where the orange flower water she wore hung faint and sweet in the warm air and looked out at the garden with an expression of perfect, unhurried composure. "Sentiment is the one coin that buys nothing, Miss Caro. I have watched a great many poor girls learn that lesson the hard way, and I confess I had hoped for your sake you would learn it the easy way instead. The Duke is fond of you. Fondness is cheap. It costs him nothing to feel it, and everything for you to rely on it. When the wedding is done, and it will be done, on the date appointed, you would do well to remember precisely what your position here is worth, and to whom. And what is it worth, in your reckoning?" "Exactly what any servant's position is worth," Adelia said, still watching the garden, still smoothing her glove. "Whatever the house that employs her chooses to pay, for exactly as long as it chooses to pay it." She left without waiting for an answer, which was, Lynette understood, itself the answer, the particular cruelty of a threat delivered so softly it could be denied, later as nothing but plain good sense. Lynette stood alone in the still room a long while after, turning the small brass catch of her mother's chest without quite meaning to, thinking not of Adelia's words, but of the tonic bottle she had glimpsed on Marigold's washstand that morning, its glass a shade darker than she remembered, its seal a slightly different wax than the apothecary in the village favored. She had noticed it the way one notices a wrong note in a familiar song, unable yet to name what precisely was wrong, only that something was. She did not yet know enough to be afraid. She only knew enough to remember it, and to say nothing, and to watch. The fever came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before Michaelmas, and it came fast, the way summer fevers did, so that by the time the household physician had been sent for a second time and had not yet returned from Bath, Marigold Ashworth lay soaked and shivering under 3 blankets, with her small hand locked white-knuckled in Lynette's. And Gabriel Ashworth sat on the far side of the bed, still in his riding clothes, having come in from the fields at a dead gallop the moment word reached him. They did not speak for the first hour, both of them occupied entirely with cool cloths and counted breaths and the particular silent labor of 2 people, determined not to let a child see them frightened. It was well past midnight when Marigold finally slept, properly slept, her breathing gone even at last, and the two of them sat back in the guttering candlelight and discovered, almost with surprise, that they were alone. "You have not slept in 2 nights," Gabriel said. "Neither have you." "I am accustomed to it. Command requires it. Occasionally, so does love," Lynette said, before she had entirely decided to say it, and then, because his eyes came up sharply at the word, added, dry as she could make it, "For a child, Your Grace." "I did not mean to imply anything requiring a second scandal this month. We have used our allotment." That earned her the laugh she had been waiting 3 weeks to hear properly, not the swallowed near smile of the library, but a real one, low and startled out of him, the kind of laugh a man has forgotten he still owns until it arrives unannounced. "You are the only person in this house who speaks to me as though I were an ordinary man," he said, when it had faded. "I find I have missed it, without knowing I missed it. It is easier to speak plainly to a man who has just watched me wring out cloths for 6 hours. Dignity does not survive a sick room. I have seen you at your least dukely, and you have seen me at my least anything at all, and we are, I think, past the need for ornament between us. Then speak plainly to me now. What is it you have not told me?" About the tonic. She had not expected the question, and it cost her a moment to decide how much of her half-formed suspicion she was willing to hand him, unfinished. "I do not know enough yet to say it and be believed," she said finally. "My mother kept records, once, of every remedy given in this house, what it was, what it did, what dose was safe. I have her book. I have not yet had the courage to open the part of it I have never opened. There is something I must show you, but not tonight. Tonight I would rather be wrong a little longer. And if you are not wrong, then I will show you," she said, "and you will not like what it costs to believe me." He studied her a long moment in the candlelight, the ring turning once around his finger, and did not ask again, which she understood correctly as its own kind of trust. The blow, when it came at breakfast, in front of Seraphina and 2 aunts and Hobbs with the coffee pot, delivered in Adelia's gentlest voice, the one she saved for the cruelties she meant to be believed. "I did not wish to speak of it," she said, folding her hands, "but I think the household ought to know, before matters go further. That Miss Caro's mother did not leave this house in good standing. She was dismissed, the year before I came, on suspicion of having hastened the old Duke's death with one of her remedies. Nothing was ever proven. Nothing was ever quite disproven either. I only think it fair that Marigold's health should not be entrusted, quite so completely, to the daughter of a woman the family itself once feared. The silence that followed had teeth in it." Lynette felt every eye at the table find her at once, felt 2 years of careful, quiet competence collapse under the weight of a single sentence she could not, in that moment, disprove. Because she did not know herself what precisely her mother had or had not done, only that Grace Caro had died 3 years later of a broken heart and a country's whispering, and had never once spoken of it to her own daughter. "That is not true," she said, and heard how thin her own voice sounded against Adelia's honeyed certainty. "Or it is not the whole of it. I do not know which, because no one troubled to tell me, and I was 12 years old when it happened." 12 is old enough to remember a mother's disgrace, Adelia said gently, and took a sip of her coffee and said nothing further, because nothing further was needed. Gabriel did not defend her, not immediately, and in the space where his silence sat, Lynette felt something in her chest go very still and very cold. The particular stillness of watching a bridge one has been standing on begin, quietly, to give way. The offer came that same afternoon, in the rose garden, from Seraphina's father, a heavy, courteous man who spoke to Lynette as though he were doing her a great kindness, which he believed entirely that he was. 200 pounds, he said, and a letter of character good enough to place you in any house in the north, where none of this unpleasantness need follow you. You need only be gone before my Kelmis. I am told you have a fondness for the child. I am told also that fondness rarely survives poverty, and 200 pounds is not poverty, Miss Caro. Take it, and take the kindness meant with it. Linnet looked at the folded bank draft in his gloved hand for a long moment, and thought of the 2 years behind her, the fevers sat through, the letters read aloud by candlelight, the small fierce grip of a child's hand in the dark, and thought, too, of her mother's name, which she had not yet cleared and could not clear from the north, from any distance at all. I am sure it is meant kindly, she said. I cannot take it. 250 then, if the sum offends your pride. It is not the sum that offends me, sir. It is the arithmetic. You are asking me to price a child's safety and my mother's name at 250 pounds, and I find, rather to my own surprise, that neither is for sale. She left him standing among the roses with his draft still folded in his hand, and walked back toward the house with her spine very straight and her eyes very dry, and did not once look back to see whether anyone had watched her refuse it, though someone had from an upstairs window and would remember it later when it mattered most. Dismissal, when it finally came from Adelia's mouth but with Gabriel silent beside her, and that silence was the part that broke something in Lynette that the words themselves could not have broken alone. It is for Marigold's sake, Adelia said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. Until the matter of your mother is settled, and until this house has finished talking, you cannot be permitted near the child. You will understand. Linnet looked at Gabriel, waiting for him to speak, to make one word of the defense he had made so freely at the feast, and watched him not make it, his jaw tight, his ring turning and turning. A man caught between a scandal he had caused and a cousin he had trusted his whole life to manage what he could not. I understand, Linnet said, when it was clear no one would say anything else, that a place kept 2 years can be unmade in one sentence, if the sentence is spoken by the right voice. She packed her mother's chest and her few plain gowns into a single trunk before nightfall, and left for the village inn before Gabriel found the courage to come and stop her, which he did not, that night, though he would remember for the rest of his life that he had stood at the library window and watched the cart carry her away, and had not moved. She had been gone 2 days when the letter reached her, delivered by a boy from the hall who would not say who had sent him, containing only a single line in Hobbs' careful, unschooled hand. Miss Marigold is worse, and asking for you, and there is a thing in the account books Mrs. Vane does not know I have seen. Linnet returned to Rathmore before dawn, on foot, her mother's chest under her arm, and found the kitchen door held open for her by Hobbs himself, who said nothing beyond, "This way, miss, and quick," before the house wakes, and led her not to the sick room, but to the estate office, where a second set of ledgers lay open on the desk beside the first, in a hand she recognized at once as Adelia's own, careful and small and utterly damning. Purchases of digitalis concentrate, monthly, disguised under the heading of tonic sundries, matched almost to the shilling against sums missing from the tenant relief accounts for the better part of a decade. Linnet's hands, opening her mother's chest at last, found the false bottom she had never before had the courage to search for, and beneath it, Grace Caro's own dosage ledger, in the same careful hand that had once kept this house's health, listing safe measures for every remedy the old apothecary had ever mixed, including, in the margin of a page dated 11 years past, a note in her mother's own writing, Mrs. A. Vane asked again today for a stronger heart tonic than the child requires. refused, will not give what is not needed. Whatever she offers. It was, Lynette understood, staring at it in the gray light, the very reason her mother had been dismissed, the true shape of a disgrace that had never been about poison at all, but about a woman who would not sell a dangerous dose to a woman who wanted one. "We will need Mr. Reeve," Lynette said, very quietly, to Hobbs, "and we will need him before Michaelmas, and we will need Sowerby from the apothecary shop to say, in front of witnesses whose hand has been signing for the deliveries." Hobbs, closing the ledger with the particular gentleness of a man closing a coffin, said only, "Then, I expect, Miss, we had better send for him tonight." They gathered on the last evening of that hard, bright summer in the long library at Rathmore Hall, with the storm that had been building all week finally breaking against the windows and sheets, thunder rolling over the roof like something enormous turning in its sleep. Mr. Absalom Reeve, the family's solicitor and trustee of Marigold's inheritance, sat at the head of the long table with his spectacles catching the candlelight, flanked by Lady Honoria, who had arrived unbidden the moment word reached her, banging her cane once against the floor by way of announcing herself. "I have buried 2 husbands and outlived a war. I did not survive either to be left out of a scandal in my own family's house." Seraphina sat near the fire, very pale, very still, her fan closed and motionless in her lap for the first time in the whole of the story, and beside her, Gabriel, who had not slept, by the look of him, since the night Lynette left. Adelia stood near the window with her back very straight, smoothing the same glove seam she always smoothed, and did not yet know how much the room already held against her. Lynette set her mother's chest on the table and opened it without ceremony. "This belonged to Grace Carow, apothecary of this house 11 years past," she said, and her voice, to her own faint surprise, did not shake. "It records every remedy given at Rathmore and every dose refused, including a dose Mrs. Vane requested and my mother would not give." She laid the ledger open to the marked page, and beside it, the second book, the one Hobbs had found, purchases of digitalis concentrate in Adelia's own hand, month upon month, matched shilling for shilling against the missing tenant funds. Foxglove, taken in small measures over time, produces exactly the sickly weakness Marigold has shown this summer. It also, taken carelessly, kills. Mr. Reeve, I believe you will find, if you compare these 2 books, that someone in this house has been giving my mother's refused dose, after all, 11 years late, and calling it medicine. Adelia's composure did not break at once. It broke the way ice breaks, in one long silence before the crack. And it was Mr. Reeve, adjusting his spectacles, who asked the single precise question that finished it, turning not to Adelia but to Sowerby, brought in dripping from the storm and seated, trembling, near the door. "Whose hand, Mr. Sowerby, signed for the digitalis parcel, delivered to this house on the 3rd of every month for the past year?" Sowerby looked once at Adelia and once at the ledger open before him, and said, in a voice gone thin with the particular relief of a small man finally allowed to stop carrying a large lie, "Hers, always hers, sir. She told me it was for the horses." "There are no horses at Rathmore treated with foxglove," Gabriel said, very quietly, and it was the quiet, more than any shout could have managed. That finally undid the last of Adelia's composure. "I only ever wanted what was fair," she said, and her voice, for the first time in the whole story, was not gentle at all, weighed out fair. "Do you know what it is, to come into a great house as a poor relation, to be given no chair at anyone's table, to watch a fortune settle on a child who will never once have to earn it? I was that girl before I was anything else in this family. I have been paying myself back, in small measures, for 20 years, and I would have gone on doing it quietly, harming no one, if the audit had not come, if the child had only stayed conveniently unwell a little longer. She touched, without seeming to know she did it, the small clasp of the bracelet at her wrist, worn thin with handling, the one plain thing she had owned before she owned anything grand at all, and for one unguarded moment the whole room saw not a villain, but a frightened girl grown old inside a costly dress, and even Lynette, who had every reason in the world to hate her, found she could not quite manage it. "You called sentiment the one coin that buys nothing," Lynette said, gently, "because there was, in the end, no need to say it unkindly. I think you have spent 20 years proving yourself wrong." Mr. Reeve cleared his throat into the long silence that followed. "There will be no prosecution," he said, "if Mrs. Vane consents to leave Rathmore before Michaelmas and to trouble this family no further. I say this not for her comfort, but for the child's. A trial would put Marigold's name in every paper in England, and I will not purchase justice at that price when Mercy will do the same work more quietly." Adelia did not argue. She looked, once at Gabriel, and once, longer, at the bracelet on her own wrist, and left the room without another word, and the storm outside chose that moment to ease, the thunder rolling off eastward, leaving only rain falling steady and ordinary against the glass, the world continuing its business exactly as it had before, indifferent to the ruin and the mercy both. It was 3 days later, with Marigold sitting up in bed asking for her lesson book in a voice grown strong again, and the true tonic, mild and honest, restored to her washstand, that Seraphina Vale came to find Lynette in the garden and said, "Without preamble, I am not sorry to be released from the wedding. I do not think you are surprised to hear it." "I confess I am not," Lynette said. "I have watched you tap that fan of yours for a month now, and it never once tapped like a woman counting down to happiness." Seraphina almost smiled. "There is a naval captain in Portsmouth who has written to me every month for 2 years and been refused every month for 2 years, because my father wished for a duchess in the family, and I did not wish to disappoint him. I find, now that the wedding is undone through no fault of my own, that I am rather looking forward to disappointing him properly. I hope he writes back quickly. He will. He is tediously reliable. It is, I have decided, an underrated quality in a husband." She left with something almost like warmth in her face, and Lynette, watching her go, thought that the county would have a second scandal to discuss within the month, and a far happier one than the first. It was that same evening, with the garden gone gold and green in the low late light, and the blackbird singing its 3 notes, and a trill from the terrace wall exactly where it had sung on the night of the feast, that Gabriel found her among the roses and said, "Without any of the ceremony a duke was supposed to employ for such things, there is no wedding now to make you cautious of, and no stake left for you to suspect me of buying. So I will ask you plainly, and you may refuse me just as plainly, and I promise you it will cost you nothing at all with me. Marry me, Lynette, not because Marigold needs a mother, and not because your name wants clearing, though I mean to see it cleared regardless, in the parish register if you will let me. Marry me because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take." Lynette looked at him a long moment, rolling a sprig of lavender between her finger and thumb, the way she always did when her heart was too full for stillness alone to hold it, and said, "At last, then I will make one." He did not understand, for a moment, and then he did. And the laugh that came out of him this time was not swallowed at all, and neither was hers. They were married in October, quietly, in the small stone church at Hartwell, with its ordinary bell and its ordinary flowers. No banners, no 400 witnesses, only the household and Marigold in her best dress standing solemnly beside them holding the ring, and Lady Honoria in the front pew weeping without the smallest attempt at dignity, banging her cane against the pew rail in what everyone chose to interpret as applause. Hobbs stood at the back in his good coat, polishing an imaginary spot on nothing at all, and cried, though he would have denied it to his last breath. Seraphina sent a letter from Portsmouth with a naval captain's signature beside her own, and a note that read only, "You were right about the fan." Sowerby kept his shop and his freedom, and, it was said, never again sold so much as a headache powder without asking twice whose hand held out the coin. Of Adelia, word came rarely from a cottage on the Yorkshire coast, modest and plain, where the allowance settled on her by Mr. Reeve arrived each quarter and was, by all reports, spent carefully, honestly, down to the last shilling. As though 20 years too late, she had finally learned the only arithmetic that had ever mattered. Grace Caro's name was cleared in the parish record that same autumn, a line added at Gabriel's own insistence, plain and permanent, and Lynette visited the small grave in the churchyard with lavender cut fresh from the still-room garden and told her mother, aloud, that the ledger had balanced at last. Almost a year to the day after the betrothal feast that had undone and remade her, Rathmore Hall filled again with candles and long tables, and the particular golden heat of late summer pressing gentle against the windows, this time for Marigold's 11th birthday. And this time, when the household gathered, there was a place set at the head of the table beside the Duke, with her own name card upon it in Marigold's careful 10-year-old hand, and no one in the room thought it strange at all. Marigold, spooning her pudding with the single-minded gravity of a child who has fully recovered her appetite, looked up at her once and asked, exactly as she always did before her lessons, "Is it sums today, or is it stories?" And Lynette, watching the candlelight move gold across the table, across the ring turning slow and settled now around her husband's finger, across the empty chair by the door that no longer needed filling, because no one sat in corners in this house anymore, answered her the way she always did. "Today," she said, "I think it might be both." Outside, in the last of the light, a blackbird sang its 3 notes and a trill, and nobody in that warm room thought to notice it at all, which was, Lynette had come to understand, the truest measure of how safely happy they had all become. If this story warmed you, if you found yourself, even for a moment, hoping someone would finally pull an extra chair up to that table for you, then come sit a while longer by this fire before you go. There is a candle lit here most evenings, and a kettle that never quite goes cold, and a chair kept, always, for anyone who has ever stood in a corner, wondering whether they belonged in the room at all. Tell me, if you would, in the comments below, was there a moment in this story when you knew, before Lynette did, exactly what Adelia was hiding? I do love hearing which thread you pulled first. And if you'd like to keep a place here with us for the next story, the subscribe button does exactly that. It simply keeps your chair by the hearth warm for whenever you're ready to come back. Until then, sleep well and be generous with the empty seats at your own table. You never know whose whole life might change because you finally set one.